Well, welcome into the Point After podcast, and this is episode 4, and we're actually going to continue kind of what we said with the spring sports, and we're going to talk state baseball, and we've got some special guests from the Oklahoma Sports Network that has been doing some great games in 5A, and we'll talk about the matchups because now we're in the final 8. We do this with basketball. Football's a little bit different. You know, you play there, you get your quarterfinals and semifinals, then you finally get to that precipice. But when you make state, and you make state in basketball and baseball, it is a special thing because now you're to the final 8, the best 8 in the class of 32 in your class size, and you bring them all together in one special environment of back to back to back, just like basketball. And this will be like a Thursday, Friday, and Saturday matchup. I want to say the Oklahoma Sports Network was privileged to be the producer for the Class A and Class B finals for the NFHS network for the OSSAA, and that was at Shawnee this past weekend. And congratulations to Class A and Class B champions. First off, we'll start off with Fort Cobb, back-to-back state champions in Class B, and that was finished off in grand fashion. There was a little bit of a rain delay. Of course, there was a lot of rain delay over the weekend, so that was a great opportunity to get their win as well. And then Class A, for the first time in school history, Amber Pocasset won a state title not only in baseball for the first time, but for any male sport for Amber. And I know they are thrilled to death to be able to hoist that and get a state championship. So we're off and running. The lower classes already finished up with Class A and Class B, and we're going to get our guys in the network on with us, with Jordan Rhea and Josh Callaway, who's been calling a lot of our games. And when you want to go to it, I do have a screenshot of the brackets. So when we talk about 4A, 5A, we'll kind of say 5A because that's really our privilege. But we want to introduce 4A first because we do have a OSN team that is involved in that. And we'll kind of go the rundown up, and those who are watching on YouTube and actually can see this, can see the graphic. Otherwise, if you're just the old traditional podcast, then it's the old audio portion of this. But we'll start up on the top bracket. These will be played at Noble High School, and we'll start off with Tuttle. And, you know, these are going to be very familiar names when you say Blanchard and Tuttle. They met last year in the 4A title for a big clash, but they're on the opposite ends of the bracket once again, and so that could be a showdown. But Tuttle will face Cushing. Hilldale will take on Marlow, and Marlow has been kind of bounced around in the different class sizes. They have been up, they've been down. Marlow is now in 4A, and so they will take on Hilldale. Elks, and they've got a great team, by the way, and so they are looking to make a statement. Elk City will take on Chickasha, and then Newcastle and Blanchard. So with my baseball co-hosts, whoever wants to start in first can join us about what they think 4A is going to look like when it's all settled and said and done on Saturday.
All right. Well, I'll lead things off here, and just for the record, I believe that Tuttle and Blanchard have been playing in the championship game 2 years in a row. Because Eric, we were fortunate to do their game at Shawnee 2 years ago, and that was a classic won by Blanchard by 1 run, the bottom of the last inning, 7th inning. And then you were there when they played again at the Bricktown Ballpark last year, and Tuttle won the rematch. And this year we're happy to be able to bring the third school that's kind of in that area, that being Newcastle. And one of the interesting things I've realized about 4A, because I haven't paid a lot of attention in the past, is, you know, in baseball they have 64 teams, not 32. And so they have 2 weekends of postseason play. And Newcastle started out losing a game early on, and they had to come from the losers bracket just to get from a regional to area. And now in the area, they swept Perkins, Tryon, I believe it was. And now here they are playing, you know, for a chance at state, or they are in state. And very, very interesting matchup. They're playing Blanchard. Those teams have actually played each other twice already, so they're very familiar with each other.
Now, also, I want to say about that Bricktown matchup last year, it was after a 4-hour rain delay. We talked about rain delays, had one this past Saturday, just a slight one, not severe weather coming in. but it was a double rainbow. I remember Kaysen, who's our videographer, took a cool shot, a picture that we have posted that was a double rainbow, and we had to wait 4 hours, and that last game was that Blanchard Tuttle game. I think we got done at about 10 or 11 o'clock because of that 4-hour rain delay and storms that had to race through. And I know that, cross our fingers, this has been a wet spring, and I know you guys have had to deal with some of delays. Just you guys had a late start, Jordan, on your game the other day, so you kind of understand that when you were covering the Midwest City Noble matchup. But that's the 4A. Anything else that you guys wanted to mention about 4A at all, outside of the two leading candidates that look like there's going to be a clash again?
Not really. Other than, again, and Josh knows a lot about this too. The rivalry across the different sports between Blanchard, Newcastle, and Tuttle. So to see two teams that are that familiar with each other play in the first round in 4A is very interesting. And the fact that we get to bring that game is going to be exciting because, again, not only do they play each other in baseball, which they played twice, but Blanchard and Newcastle know each other from all sorts of different things because they're close to each other in proximity, close in size. And that's going to make an interesting game that they know each other so well. So once we talk 5A, we're talking matchups there where the teams may be somewhat familiar with each other, but you're talking East Side teams versus West Side teams. So this is an interesting contrast to me.
Yeah,
and Josh, you covered Newcastle, so you kind of know that very well.
Yeah, I mean, the most that jumps off the page for me, certainly when looking at that 4A bracket, is all those Tri-City teams all being there. And with Tuttle and Blanchard, like you guys have said, I've kind of ran the class last couple of years. Then Newcastle get in there as well. I mean, those three schools are within 10 minutes-ish of each other. They all know each other really well. Huge rivalry matchup anytime you get a combination of those three. So from all three to be there is pretty fun. I mean, a couple of those schools have had great seasons. I mean, Marlowe didn't lose a district game this year. I know Cushing had a very nice season. I mean, everybody did if you're there. But it's a competitive bracket, whereas in 5A, like Jordan said, we'll get there, where there's a clear, I feel like, favorite. I don't know if that's necessarily the case in 4A. There are the favorites. I mean, Tuttle's, they won 35 games, whatever it was again. I mean, they're a very good program. But it's a very competitive class, lots of fun matchups. And like Jordan said, I believe that him and I are going to have that Newcastle Blanchard game on Thursday night, and that'll be a lot of fun because those Tri-City teams, when they get together, it's always fun in any sport. So for them all to be there is, I think, the really cool kind of aspect or angle of that 4A.
Well, a little tease too that I'm going to, it's not been approved yet through the OSSAA, but I know that some schools have already leaked their little football schedules. And I was looking at Newcastle, and this is interesting because if it is solidified, even though they're going to go up to 5A in football, they're still wanting to take on those rivalries that they're so entrenched as a non-district schedule, and we'll get to football later, but for them to say, we still want to play Tuttle, we still want to play Blanchard, and even though we're 5A and they're 4A, we want to play them as non-conference games. And by the way, we'll throw in Elgin, who's now back to 4A as well. And you talk about battle tested for football if that is approved, but that's an interesting makeup. But it just shows you the tradition, it shows you the rivalry, and it shows you what's important to them. Okay, so let's go over to 5A, and on the screen, you're seeing that from the Oklahoma Secondary Schools Activities Association bracket that was just released today. And so we'll talk about this Thursday, Friday, Saturday matchup. For those who are just listening, we'll bring it down to you. On the top side of the bracket shows Carl Albert with Sapulpa. Then Elgin will take on Collinsville. Collinsville, very, very tradition in baseball. They seem to be there every year, and they're a familiar name in dominance when it comes to baseball. Tahlequah, then Noble, Coweta, and Duncan. And we have kind of seen all of these guys in games throughout the year. So you guys are best to know who has got what when it comes down to the breakdown with Noble that you've seen, Duncan that you've seen, and of course, Carl Albert and Elgin, some of these schools on our network.
Well, I'll let Josh talk about Carl Albert because he's seen him plenty, saw the last few games. But the other three West teams, we've been fortunate to have some at one point their games on the Oklahoma Sports Network. Elgin, when they came to Midwest City, we actually had a doubleheader also with Midwest City against Duncan. And then obviously Midwest City has played 3 games against Noble we put on the network, as well as Noble played Carl Albert. And so it's interesting, a couple of those schools that Eric used to be with the Oklahoma Sports Network. But I think Duncan had a very interesting draw because the one team the team that they're going to play in Coweta is the one team in this entire tournament that state tournament in 5A that did not host a regional. So Coweta went on the road basically to get to state, and Duncan. I'm not saying it's a favorable matchup for the Demons, but I definitely like Duncan. I would say that by winning the district and they are in 5A2, they proved themselves to probably be the second best team in the West. I think talent-wise, behind obviously Carl Albert. And then Noble and Elgin, they're going to play the two teams that won the districts in 5A out east in Collinsville, and then the other one being Tahlequah. And so, at this point, it doesn't really matter when you talk about teams that won versus teams that finished runner-up in district. Not a lot, because Carl Albert last year won the state tournament, and they did not win their district. But it's just interesting contrast, and that's how the tournament's designed. And so, I think Elgin, they have the tools. Duncan, of course, has an OU commit, and Jace Ramirez, or Eli Ramirez. Sorry, Jace is his brother. Noble has a young team. All three of those teams, I think, will be really good next year. Carl Albert will have a bit of a rebuilding mode in 5A West, but those other three West Side teams have some really good talent returning. Of course, we know the names for Elgin. We mentioned them before: Trace Laura, Ritzenmeyer from football. Noble's got a former Bomber and Trevor Hand as their cleanup hitter and catcher, who's a very powerful hitter, very good athlete. Besides just being a catcher, and they got a center fielder who is just a very dynamic leadoff hitter, and he's so good on the base pass and so good at getting on base that it's going to be interesting to see how the top of the order responds. They got a really good top of the order that will battle you. And the key is again going to be pitching. So we'll track down for Elgin, who started in the regional against Guthrie, because they lost their first game against Guthrie 10-0. But they came back from the losers bracket and won 3 straight and 2 straight against Guthrie to get there. So will that affect how their pitching rotation looks? Those are some things we'll inform you on when we get their games on the network.
Yeah, the question,
Josh, you're going to talk about Carl Albert, but
sure.
All we've seen is, as far as me on the outside, is just their scores. I mean, they'll get up on you and they'll score a bunch.
Yeah, I mean, that's the question going into the 5A bracket for me, is just, can anybody stop Carl Albert? This is a team that, obviously defending champs. It's a program that lives in the state tournament. They don't have any noticeable weaknesses or holes. I've had the chance to see them, 4 or 5 times now this year. They ran through their regional, and they won the 3 games by a combined 49-2. They're matching the baseball. They have a 3-man rotation in the pitching staff that's, you have a Cash Ferris, a guy who's committed to Oklahoma State, obviously, who's arguably the best pitcher in the state, but then 2 guys behind him in Sammy Gonzalez and Declan Murphy. That would be the ace of most staffs, across the state as well. So they are absolutely stacked in every single way. They're playing baseball at the right, their best ball at the right time. They haven't lost a game since I think it's April 5th. Going back and looking at their schedule, they've just been mowing through opponents the last month or so. And, you think back to last year, the state tournament up in Jinx. I had the pleasure of doing all 3 of their games in that championship run. The team that pushed them the most was the first game against Collinsville. So that's the matchup that, if that's the way it goes in the second round, and obviously both teams have got tough matchups to start, with Carl Albert playing Sapulpa and then, Collinsville playing Elgin. But if that's a matchup in the semifinal, that would be really intriguing to me, because that was the one game that last year was, Carl Albert at least had to sweat it out a little bit. Every other game they really controlled wire to wire. So that would be the matchup that would catch my eye. But yeah, the 5A bracket's got some really good teams, like Jordan said, with Elgin and Duncan, and I would throw Collinsville certainly in there as well. So it's a really competitive bracket, lots of good teams, and I look forward to seeing how that shakes out, when we get there later this week, because the Titans, like I said, they're a team that doesn't have any noticeable weaknesses with the way they can score, the way they can pitch. And so they're going to be tough to beat. And I'm also very interested to see how they handle the pitching, because when you do have such a clear number one, like I said, best pitcher in the state, arguably, in Cash Ferris, when do you use them? Do you go ahead and use them on Thursday? Do you try to save them back? That's risky if risky game there. So how Coach Whiteley kind of handles that is going to be really interesting to see as well on Thursday.
By the way, let me add a couple things I forgot to give to mention. Noble's leadoff hitter, I forgot his name, is Bryson Carey. And he came on and pitched relief in that extra inning game against Midwest City on Saturday. So I think I really like him as a player, very dynamic player, great center fielder. And then a little bit more about Kawita. That's Duncan's first round matchup. They went to Pryor. The interesting thing about that is they did beat Pryor head to head the first time, but usually you got to beat the host team twice. Well, what happened is Pryor then had to turn around and play, of all teams, Del City. And after beating Del City 16-0 in the first round, lost to Del City in the consolation game 6-4. And Del City advanced the championship round, and Kawita took care of them. So it's not to take away from what Kawita did. It's amazing. It's just shocking they didn't have to beat the host team twice. Does that mean they're the worst team in the tournament? Not at all. But on paper, they would kind of look like maybe that's a favorable matchup for Duncan, and they may prove me wrong. Carl Albert, on the other hand, playing Sepulpa. Well, the Chieftains, they're good year in, year out. And they were ahead in their district, I think almost wire to wire. And Tahlequah won 2 games against him to go past him, but at the very end. So I'm expecting Sepulpa to be a tough matchup for Carl Albert. But just to echo what Josh said, Cash Ferris, he was hurt for much of the year. He's come back the last 2 or 3 games and been able to give him a lot of innings. And so and also dominate. So that's one of the things you like about Carl Albert is that they're healthy now, or as healthy as they've been. And so they're really clicking right now.
Josh, I'm going to ask you, because you say, well, they're a complete team, but what impresses you the most with Carl Albert?
I think probably, honestly, I mean, the lineup and the fact how well all guys 1 through 9. This is a really old Carl Albert team. We were there for their senior night. It's basically their entire starting 9 outside of really one regular starter. They're all seniors. It's a very old team. I think more than anything, their offensive approach is what you'd expect from a team of seniors. It's very mature. They just don't get themselves out. They work counts. They don't chase pitches out of the zone. You have to make, I was talking about it with Jared Price, who was doing the broadcast with us, last week at the regional. You have to make 3 good pitches to get a Titan hitter out. I mean, that's the reality of it. They can just battle with you. Like I said, they don't leave the zone. They stay within their approach. Very mature at bats 1 through 9. So I think more than anything, the lineup is so hard to navigate. They're good on the bases. They got a lot of speed. A couple of guys in Sammy Gonzalez and Tanner Norman who can hit it out of the ballpark at any time. Like I said, there isn't a lot of very noticeable weaknesses to beat Carl Albert. And it can happen. It's baseball and it's a single elimination tournament. But to beat Carl Albert, you have to play borderline perfect to do it. And it can happen. Teams do that. But that's what it takes to beat them, in a 7-inning baseball game. And that's why you have to favor them and why they're so tough to beat year in and year out in this thing.
Now, right underneath them is Elgin, and we got to talk about this. And Jordan just briefly mentioned them because, I'm away doing other things, and you're just seeing updated scores. And I knew that Elgin had to face Altus last year and then Guthrie, and that was the showdown again. Altus was not there in that district. They were moved over where Carl Albert was, but Guthrie was there again. And my eyebrows were raised when Elgin, in that first game, I got 11-0. And then came out and only had like a 3-hit win with, just enough to get that. And then finally they took it to Guthrie in that final one pretty handily. So I was trying to figure out who is the real Elgin. And I know it, pitching, we talked about this, it's a gamble of who you put in where, and it's a jockeying for these coaches to make sure that, hey, you've got your best ace when it counts. But what can we say about Elgin with coming into it? Because they've got a lot. They got a chip on their shoulder. They had some success last year, and they want to continue. So, what can we see from them, especially in this first showdown with Collinsville?
So, I believe the pitcher's name that threw no hitter against Guthrie was Sutherland. I'll have to make sure I pronounce it right. Sutherland, and that was a big deal because that was an elimination game. But he basically only walked 3 in 7 innings and threw a no-hitter. And that was game 2 against Guthrie. I say game 2 it was their 4th game of the district, but their 2nd game against Guthrie. So it'll be interesting to see. I think his first name's Jackson Sutherland. When will he be used again? Because he's the hot pitcher. Will they move him back as their ace in their ace position? Usually what I'm finding out, Eric, is you pitch your ace first day of the state tournament. So nothing's official right now. We're going to talk to these coaches and hopefully find out. But I'm expecting Cash Ferris to pitch on Thursday for Carl Albert. Will Elgin pitch Jackson Sutherland, who's their 2 starter? Will he be moved to their number 1 starter? And so that'll be interesting to see, because obviously he kind of saved the team after that tough loss they had against Guthrie. We don't know all the circumstances where it may have been a close game that got away from him late when they lost the first game 10-0. And then, they have a young lineup.
I think they had 5 runs. I think they walked 5 runs. I think is what I was told by one of the fans, because I wasn't there. But yeah, I think that first game was kind of disastrous like that.
Right. I'll point out too with Elgin too, and that regional was really kind of a microcosm. And I haven't had the pleasure of seeing them in person. Look forward to seeing it on Thursday. But you kind of look at their season the way it went. They've had kind of a little bit of a Jekyll and Hyde year. They've had some really impressive showings, and now they handed it to Carl Albert back in early March. And I have no idea who pitched for Carl Albert that day. It was like the 5th or 6th game of the year, but they beat the Titans 9-2. And it almost doesn't matter who's pitching for Carl Albert. To hold that lineup to 2 runs and to beat them that soundly, it says something. And they have some nice wins under their belt, but they also have a couple losses that you're kind of looking at the schedule. And again, without seeing the games, lacking the context, but you're kind of wondering what happened there. Some losses to some Class A and B teams, not some good A and B teams, but still matchups you'd expect them to take care of. So they've had kind of a weird up and down year, but I think Elgin at their best, it would seem, is capable of beating just about anybody. And so that's going to be what's exciting to see on Thursday, is kind of which Elgin do we get? Because if they put together for 3 days, they could be holding the championship trophy at the end of this thing, I think, easily.
Yeah, and that's what I like about these classes, both 4A and 5A. You're going to really see some great baseball. So whether you go to Edmond or Noble, a little side note, that is a change that for the West Side teams, we're very, very encouraged to know that the 5A and 6A, from 4A, 5A, 6A will all be at Bricktown, and you love to make the trip to Oklahoma City. Nothing against Tulsa, but from what I understand from the OSSAA was explaining on the broadcast this past weekend of why that changed, is that the Drillers had I guess they put their field out to be able to use in other sources, as you well know. And I think soccer had it already locked in on that weekend. So Shawnee had that tornado last year, took them out, and so they were unavailable, but they were able to host the A and B finals, which we talked about at the beginning of this broadcast. So their field is up and running and ready, so they can take the lower classes, and that gets now 5A, 6A instead of a trip to Tulsa, unless Collinsville would say, well, we'd like to have it in our neck of the woods, some of these East Side schools. But for the West Side, for Carl Albert, for Elgin, for Duncan, a trip to Bricktown, and that's such a nice setting too. It's so great and we're going to see I would say, some great baseball 3 days in a row for Thursday, Friday, Saturday.
Yep. I mean, the cream comes to the crop, rises to the top, or whatever the saying is.
Yeah, that's it.
Yep. And I think the interesting thing about baseball is, well, a couple things. One is who has it. It doesn't really come down maybe as much to who has the best lineup, who has the most pitching depth, who has the best number 2 and number 3 starters, besides, assuming that every team has a really good ace. And then the other thing is, whatever class you're talking about, I don't think there's as huge of a discrepancy between, like, say, 6A and 4A, because these 4A schools, they're in a more rural area, and they just have a good culture, and they have as much, baseball talent as 6A. You don't necessarily see that in football or basketball.
Yeah, the other X factor too that's absolutely impossible to predict is just how these guys handle the moment of it. You saw it last year in some of the state tournament games I did. You take a 1-run lead to the 7th. Just handling that is honestly as big of a key as anything. And it's impossible to prepare for it. It's impossible to predict it. But just making the routine play on a ground ball right at you when it's an out in the 7th inning to try and steal the game, like nothing, you can take nothing for granted in games like this. And so every little play, every little moment in the game can be the difference in it. And that's what makes postseason baseball, really, really fun, especially in this format, the state tournament, where it's just one and done. I mean, when you have the regional, you have a little bit of buffer, you have the cushion of your season's not going to necessarily end on one mistake, but it could absolutely happen in the state tournament. That's what makes these games between all these good teams really, really fun. So I'm excited to see it.
Well, we're looking forward to it, and I want to thank both of you guys who have really, took our baseball and took it to the next level with some great games. And boy, we've had several in the regionals, and now we've got to state, and we're still here, still talking about it. We're still going to cover Elgin, we'll cover Carl Albert, and we'll cover now Newcastle, part of the Oklahoma Sports Network, and that will be Thursday, Friday, and hopefully Saturday we'll have some representation there as well. Josh Callaway, and you can get him at Josh M. Callaway. I see that there on the screen. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
You can contact him there. And Jordan Ray, of course, doing everything he can. I don't even know if you have a favorite sport, Jordan. And when I talk to you at basketball, you're the guru of basketball. Baseball, you're right on it, and you're a football guy too. So I guess it's good that we're having you guys on the network because of your expertise.
Well, those are the big three sports for me. Basketball is my favorite. That's the only one I can do color commentary on, to me. But I know some things about the other two, and also want to mention, I think first pitch for Carl Albert, their game at Edmond Santa Fe High School should be 11 a.m. They take on Sapulpa, and then the Elgin game will be right after that. So it works out nicely. I believe it's 1:30 there.
Yep.
And also works out nicely. There's no conflict there with those two games in Newcastle because that game is late at 6:30 over at Noble. So those three games will all be on in their own time.
And we'll preface this, weather permitting, and I hope that
good.
we've had all the rain, all that stuff this past week, and the start of this week. Hopefully it'll be a nice, I've not looked at the forecast, but a nice Thursday, Friday, Saturday.
It looks nice at this point, yes.
I would say it looks great right now, but we got a few days to get there.
But in Oklahoma, they always say, if you don't like Oklahoma weather, wait a minute.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
That's the saying. Okay, well, Josh Callaway, Jordan Ray, we appreciate that. A little rundown of our baseball, and that is concluding our episode 4 already in the books for the Point After podcast. We hope to continue this on a weekly basis. So after all state baseball is done and all these spring sports are finished and we have graduation, don't worry. We've still got content because we've got spring football to talk about. And boy, will that be fun to talk about with the changes of who's in 4A and who's in 5A and who's in what district. And that will all be official, and we'll be able to get that to you as well. So live from the Cameron Podcast Studios in the Cetus building of Cameron University, this has been a presentation of the Oklahoma Sports Network right here with the Point After on the Oklahoma Sports Network.